All right, thank you. We are back. We're back for the Zona Hurston Festival. For this year, because this question of vision is so important, I thought it was important for us to think about the implication of Afrofuturism as a global dialogue and an intersection with a number of other conversations that are happening about the future. If you're a scholar of Afrofuturism, you realize that there seemingly is an explosion of futurist narratives that reflect many of the same concerns articulated by Afrofuturists, be it indigenous futurism, Desi futurism, Armenian futurism, so on and so forth. To think about this in the context of the Hurston Festival, of course, and think about this in the context of Florida is important because Florida has always been a transnational space. There's a long history of many people from many parts of the world coming here and helping to form the narrative of the sort of collective experience. To talk about Desi futurism, meaning the diaspora that's connected to India, I could think of no better person to talk to than my colleague, my former colleague, my friend, poet, multimedia artist, thinker, shaper, creative, Vidhu Aggarwal, who's a professor of English at Rollins College, my former institution. Vidhu has written about postcolonial theory, modern poetics. She's a poet with several books to her name. The Trouble with Humpadori is one of my favorites, and her newest book, Daughter Isotope, is a real tour de force, sort of exemplifying the kind of creative work that she does. But as a theorist, thinking about Desi futurism, I think she's one of the people who helps me understand the importance of these alternate kind of futurist narratives. I wanted to have a conversation with her about this. So Vidhu, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Julian. And I just want to say that my thinking around futurism has come from our longstanding conversations, right?
Right.
Yes.
So this is one of the things about Afrofuturism and futurism in general in a contemporary moment that's really important for us to understand. I think it's easy for the general public. It's important to recognize this when the Hurston Festival of Arts and Humanities is a public humanities project. It has been a longstanding one. And there is a goal within the organization to talk about the ways that arts and humanities are shaping our experience and the importance of them to our understanding. So in the context of that, the idea that Afrofuturism is something that is new, this has been one of the things that we've really pushed in this cycle to expand people's understanding of the origins of Black speculative practice. But the idea that other marginalized groups or other diasporas have ideas about the future that doesn't necessarily find purchase in the Western dialogue and the Western discourse is an important one. And so there's both a kind of parallelism to, I think, Desi futurism, which I understand is a very complicated term.
Yeah.
But I also think it mirrors some of the same concerns that we might think about in terms of the African diaspora. So I think probably the easiest thing is to ask you, like, could you define this very problematic term of Desi futurism for people?
So, okay, so Ryan D'Souza, he has theorized the term Desi futurist. And Desi, Desh, comes from the Hindi term for kind of like paisano or countryman. And it's a sort of imagined idea of community that is coming from the diaspora of South Asia. The reason the term is contested is because Desh comes from a North Indian language, Hindi. And there's many languages and many sort of diasporas in India and in South Asia that feel like the term Desh, or this idea of Hindi is an oppressive language. Right. So there's multiple language traditions there. But the idea is that it's a site of, the idea, at least for D'Souza, is it's a site of resistance, right? And a way of having people connect across multiple immigration patterns, et cetera, right? So you have people that came to the Caribbean from India as a sort of forced migration. You also have, people who came during the 60s and the 70s after the Immigration Act that were that were coming as part of, like, my family came through these visas that were given to professional class in India. So it was part of the brain drain. So you have multiple histories of people who have immigrated across different places, whether, in African countries, Europe, Caribbean, and the US. So this idea is that it is embodying some sort of imaginary space, right? An imagined community for people who might not have such a direct link to the homeland or to whatever that idea of homeland might be.
Right, so I really appreciate you offering that definition, in part because it calls attention to a similar set of conversations that happens in Afrofuturism. Recently, in the last few years, Nnedi Okorafor, a very well-known
Yes.
Afrofuturist author, has talked about, she doesn't actually do Afrofuturism, she does what she calls African futurism, and she makes a hard, not hard, she makes an argument that part of her experience as a Nigerian American and part of the work that she's doing is really rooted in the reality of Africa as a continent, even though that itself is a constructed space. Like she talks about this when she writes about the definition of African futurism. And so one of the things I think is noteworthy in your description of the sort of DESI question is the multiple narratives, multiple generations that are associated with diaspora, like the movement of people, and the different ways that these people might in fact be accessing the future because they have different set of circumstances.
Right, right.
So when you think about DESI futurism as a dialogue, how do those different generations, how do the communities created by these different generations of movement and culture, how do they come together to create something that is a more unified future? Like, what are the implications of a kind of DESI future construction? Because I think one of the things that you mentioned in some of your conversations about this is that the idea of DESI future is very important, in part because of the way that it's engaging with trying to understand the past as much as it's trying to forecast the future because of this contested nature. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So, and maybe I'm going to talk about this in a little bit of a roundabout way, because one of the things that I've been really thinking about has been like, okay, so I'm accessing personally this idea of South Asia from a very American perspective that's completely disconnected, or not completely, but pretty disconnected, despite the sort of fact that my parents grew up there, right? So it was really interesting to me to look at, there's this book by Bill B. Mullen called Afro-Orientalism. Okay, and he discusses Du Bois, his early interaction with India and these movements for independence in India. So one of the interesting things that Mullen brings up is the sort of transnational character of Du Bois's work and his sort of links to people in these nationalist movements in India or independence movements in India. And we know that Du Bois is one of the, he's an early futurist writer. He wrote the Comet, right? But he also wrote this book called The Dark Princess, which Homi Bhabha calls like this sort of Bollywood romance, right? So he was playing with the idea of this, like a sort of Asia and the sort of a dialogue between African Americans and Asian sort of cosmologies and ideas as a potential place of resistance, right? So the resistance would be through that sort of transnational communication. And to me, that's very powerful, right? Because partly, I think that for people who are in the US, as opposed to people who are doing this work in India, that in as much as I am influenced by my parents who have a much more direct connection, but something that has been dissolved to a certain extent, that like the idea of Afro-Orientalisms and Black Orientalisms, which come about in some way from American Orientalisms, like the ways in which Asian cultures have been disseminated in the US. Okay, but the position that Black Americans have taken have been very different, right? And the way that they've mobilized and deployed this is to create a counter space. And so I'm thinking of myself as being somebody who is also dealing with both this sort of parental, like sort of ancestral tradition that in some ways I don't have access to, right? This lineage that has been broken, maybe. And then also this idea of the way in which Asianness has been represented and disseminated in the West. And what that means for me. So in a way, I also think of myself as an Asian Orientalist, weirdly enough, right? How can that be? Do you know?
Yeah.
Does that make it?
Yeah, I do know. And I want to ask about this because I think one of the ways that what you're describing corresponds to Afrofuturism is that there are lots of different tenets that are used to describe Afrofuturism, but there are these broad fields where it kind of expresses itself. There's an aesthetic, there's a kind of metaphysics. We think about it in terms of a gender, and we can think about it in terms of like these questions around community. And it seems to me that some of the work that we see on display in your work, Daughter Isotope, for instance, calls attention to all those things as a consequence of the sort of Desi diaspora, the South Asian diaspora, that connection to the home, these different generations of people, they all represent particular narratives of identity. They all represent a kind of like Western experience, but they also have to contend with what you talked about, a kind of lost past that's not necessarily always direct, but also the implications of being a subject body in the West, a subject of modernity.
Right. So that becomes a shared, so can there be a sort of shared experience that we draw from that recognizes the different ways in which people have come to be diasporic subjects, right? So there's one thing, but I think it's really interesting. Okay, maybe I'm not answering your question.
No, you are answering my question. I want you to talk about this idea of the subject and the West, because that, of course, is very important.
Well, see, right. And so this is why one of the things that I've been looking at is, works by, so there's this work by, and I can't, Alice Coltrane did the World Galaxy. She was really influenced by like East Asian religions, right? And then that provided this idea, and Kara Keeling talks about this, she's a critic, about the sort of her idea of world galaxy is sort of embedded in her examination of like Asian tradition. She actually had an ashram. Okay, and so it provided another way. There's also, like, I'm thinking even of this poet Robin Cox Lewis, right? She is an African-American poet, and she studied Sanskrit at Harvard, like when she was in grad school. And she talked about the temporalities in that language as sort of, in this interview as being really interesting, because in Sanskrit, it isn't like a clear subject verb object, right? So times exist differently in the language. There's a sort of plurality of temporalities that exist potentially in that language that was really helpful or moving for her. And so these are the sorts of things. Now, at the same time, if you think about Sanskrit and this Brahmanical tradition in terms of India right now, there's this sort of Hindu nationalist movement. So there can be a problem. So I feel like there can be a problem with like sort of imagining a direct sort of line to the past that might be more fundamentalist and exclusive, that excludes multiple other folks, right? Like, and so sometimes nationalist movements or fundamentalist Hinduism can be very damaging actually, I think it's, you know, we can think of like these, like those nationalist narratives it's taking from this past and saying that it's we can actually access this pure past. And so that becomes the thing that we as diasporic sort of artists have to contend with, because you don't want to replicate a system that is, you know, that's saying I have a pure line to the past, because then you might say, okay, Christians are not wanted, Muslims are not wanted. All of these other groups can be oppressed by your sense of this, like, you know, very, you know, this sort of legacy that authorizes you to be sort of dominant and ascendant.
So one of the things that's really interesting, of course, when we make this comparison between Desi-futurism and Afrofuturism is the implication of you have two diasporas, African diaspora, Indian diaspora, that have multiple communities around the world, that have these generational narratives, different networks that brought people to different places at different moments. Some of them connected to labor, some of them connected to economic opportunity. And the African diaspora, of course, the forced migration, slavery, these are defining things, but they do exist in the context of the Desi. Right. But at the same time, because you have so many examples, you mentioned Alice Coltrane, think about Martin Luther King's fascination with Gandhi, like
absolutely,
continuing engagement, in particular, an engagement around kind of post-colonial liberatory
liberatory practices. Like, how can you, like, but see, for me, it's always going to be a sort of assemblage. So I feel like I've learned a lot from Afrofuturists, right? Like in this idea of the possibility of assembling things like this sort of cosmic bricolage, like assembling multiple histories together in an imaginative way.
And so the question becomes, I think, especially for Afrofuturism as a contemporary movement that is very concerned with like rethinking modernity. And when we say modernity in this context, this is a very academic conversation, but an important one because we're really talking about the ways that Afrofuturism speaks to structure, speaks to the past, but also is trying to advocate for a different future. And that future that it's advocating for asks us to value different things that help construct the contemporary moment. And so for Afrofuturists or Desi-futurists, I think there's a really important question of like, what's the break point going to be? What are the practices that we have to put into place? What are the values that we have to put in place to make that better future? So this contested past that I think you're referring to, which I think also comes through in the effort on the part of Afrofuturists to recover the voices of women, recover the voices of marginalized people, recover those lost spaces, lost communities. All these things come to play. And I think I hear you talking about very similar things in terms of Desi-futurist movement, problematic as the term may be. And so when you think about pushing forward and moving forward, what are the things that you're looking for? What are the artists? What are the practices that make Desi-futurism so powerful for you as a sort of transformative tool that resonates, I think, in the minds of a lot of people with Afrofuturism?
Well, I think that there, and I was going to talk about this with these slides as well, but there's certain artists that I think, I mean, I'm really interested in artists that take a sort of transnational approach. And so, for instance, there is a visual artist, Reena Banerjee, right? And for me, there's a sense of drawing from multiple artistic traditions, like, and multiple media, right? And so Reena Banerjee is a visual artist, and you know, one of the things that she really highlights in some of her work is the nature of commerce and trade and commodity. And she creates these assemblages out of it, and an item that she uses is a cowrie shell. And the thing about the cowrie shell is that it was an important item of trade across the Indian Ocean. You know, that's also a contested term, trade between, you know, this sort of longer history of trade between India and Africa. And I think one of the things Du Bois was trying to get at was that there were other forms of connections that you could look at between groups of people that are elided through European colonialism, right? Like how can we actually think about forms of connections that are not only vis-a-vis like the European,
Right.
okay?
And the idea, especially I think in terms of Afrofuturism, of what Kojo Oshun might refer to as the musological turn, which depends at some level on speculative work, that depends on level on artistic work, right? And so this is why we'll transition a little bit here to hear some of your poetry and see some of the work that you've been working on. That musological turn, in part, takes into account these lost histories, these connections between places like Africa and India, but also, I think at some level, ask us to take the symbolage of these different experiences of modernity that multiple people have and make something new. And the artists and the artistic objects that resonate in a lot of the futurist narratives often seem on first glance as transgressive. And I want you to talk a little bit about, especially since we're gonna hear some of your poetry, the importance of the artist as a filter, a muse, a shining the light on the different possibilities. Because of course, I think about this in the context of Zora Hurston and W.E. Du Bois. These are scholars, these are artists, these are activists that are working in all those spaces, but with a singular goal around liberation, around transformation, around freedom. So as an artist, how would you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think, I think that one of the things that for me is really important, particularly, is to recognize that I grew up in Louisiana and Texas. And there was and I have this distinct feeling that and as somebody who was coming in is seen as a foreigner in some ways. And like sort of, even though I pretty much grew up here, I was learning American culture, not through my parents, right? US culture, but like through this sort of experience of like this day-to-day that my parents couldn't tell me what was going on. And so really, I had Black teachers. Like some of the earliest poems and things that I read were by Langston Hughes. And I had this idea of American culture and American tradition not simply being white, right? And so I think that that's important for me to recognize this very central part of US culture as highlighting. I mean, I don't know if I'm saying this correctly or well, but I feel like there is this, in all of these aspects of US cultural products, whether it be jazz music, like literary arts, there is this Blackness embedded in it that is often disavowed, right, as this sort of genius. And so for me, I want that to be evident, at least, or to say that I have this direct influence in terms of those sorts of practices, growing up in this like really, this space that was very like overtly racist.
Right.
Yeah.
Overtly racist, but at the same time, deeply connected to the diasporas of Latin America. I mean, you think about Texas, you think about the legacy
exactly,
of
the
food, the language, all these things.
And all these different diasporas were there,
Yeah.
right, that were existing simultaneously in Texas, yes.
Well, we are going to make a transition to allow you to, I know you have a presentation you want to give. I do want to say to people watching, if you have questions for Vidhu, especially about her take on Futurism, or have questions about her presentation here, her reading, if you're going to put a comment in the chat, you have to make sure you put in the Q&A box. So if you're going to make a comment and you're online, make sure you place in the Q&A box. And I'm going to step away, and Vidhu is going to give us a reading from her work, and I'll.
Or just like
turn
a
over.
kind of a reading and an explanation. Like, so, I'm just going to contextualize. Okay, sorry about that. Contextualize some of this stuff. And I think one thing is that my work, I think of it as very collaborative. Okay, so I'm going to play this from the start. Okay, so you can see this is a image from this comic image is from this comic collaboration that I did with Bishak Sam. And so for me, I'm really thinking about assemblage and this idea of the cloud in my work, right? And Daughter Isotope, which is my latest work, is arranged in a series of clouds. So I'm thinking about, like, say, digital archives and sort of networked archives. So when we think of a cloud, we can both think about the ways in which how people pass down information through networks. Right now, when we think of a digital cloud, we think of it in terms of computer networks, but there's always been these sorts of networks in which people sort of continue and shift and change information. So for me, I'm interested, I talked a little bit about this idea of cosmic assemblage, like taking things from multiple arenas and putting them together in a layered way. And so what Ryan Aaron D'Souza, of course, with Desi Futurism, recognizes the condition of post-coloniality. And so a few of the works that I think maybe I'm in conversation with are like, I don't know if you know Arthur Jafa's Love is a Message, the Message is Death. It's a really amazing video work in which he looks at the archive of a lot of images of Black life and puts it in relationship to this sort of, is this not showing? This cosmic realm, and with this music by Kanye West. And then also, I don't know if you know The Digital Thief of the Last Angel of History, the 1996 film by John Okomfra, which is this sort of, there's this like character of the digital thief that takes from all of these spaces in history to reconstruct something new. And I mentioned Alice Coltrane and Reena Banerjee. So, so one of the things that's important to my work is this idea of avatar. And like if you see over here, this is Krishna, who is an avatar of the god Vishnu in the Mahabharata. He shows up in the Bhagavad Gita. But avatar is a term that we use a lot nowadays. And avatar means descent in Sanskrit, literally. It's an incarnation of a Hindu god in flesh or material form, but it's also the word for digital identity in the West, right? Like we all have our avatars, our digital avatars online. And there was an idea, at least early on, that this idea of avatarization would create a sense of liberation online, right? Like you could take on any alternative persona, but yet oftentimes those personas could actually be embedded in the same racialized narratives that there were in the past. So what I try to do is collide. I mean, I think mostly my work is trying to collide these meanings and registers of this term avatar. So I'm really focusing on like different personas, whether online or otherwise. Okay, so Krishna, like I said, is an avatar of Vishnu, Arjun's best friend. This is like a story from the Mahabharata. You know, they kind of are trying to do this apocalyptic war. And so I think it's interesting that avatar, the idea of avatar, especially within this narrative of Krishna and Arjun, is about friendship, right? The avatar of God comes down to you as a friend. And so to me, I have all these poems about friends. Okay, like what is the mode of kinship that is friendship? We also know the idea of avatar from James Cameron's movie Avatar. It's a neo-imperial going native, right? Like this guy who is, you know, from the West, goes onto this other planet and takes on this embodiment of the other, right? So there's the possibility of playing at being the other, which is, you know, sort of problematic. But then there's also this 2015 book by Yuri McMillan called Embodied Avatars, which I think is really interesting because he's talking about Black performers and using the idea of avatar to talk about how, he says, wielding their bodies as pliable matter. He talks about Adrian Piper and other artists. They repeatedly become objects, and often in the form of simulated being, or what I call avatars. I call this process performing objecthood. And so I had already been doing my project for a long time, and I just encountered Yuri McMillan's use of avatar. So I think that it's really interesting because he's applying it to Black subjectivity, and it's something that I'm doing. And I think that there is, you know, in that a sort of transnational sort of collaboration, which I think is really interesting, like taking these terms from Sanskrit and sort of applying it to this way in which Black performers negotiate their bodies and the sight of themselves as objects, right? And make that like very dynamic. So for me, I think of avatar in two different ways. So in Humpadori, which is this book, The Trouble with Humpadori, Humpadori is a race monster. So I think of the avatar literally as descent into an abject body and into commodity. So for me, these are various avatars of the racialized migrant body, okay? And you can, so I'm gonna like play this little thing.
Humpadori, Hansel, and Gretel were rejected and also wanted as butterballs. We drop crumbs like bombs from our bums, little nuclear shits, happy to blast the homeland in blitz. You like to watch us shiver in a dirty heap of shivering.
Okay, so this is like a recording made by Kathleen Bota, and I just thought it was really funny at how flat it is. So generally when I perform this, I go, okay, so let's say this is somebody else's performance, and I really like hearing things in multiple voices and this sort of iterability of the poems. So if I performed it, I'd be like this. Humpadori, Hansel, and Gretel were rejected and also wanted as butterballs. We drop crumbs like bombs. You know what I'm saying? So I'm like very, like I'm sort of wild, and then this is like very flat. And so I think that that sort of difference is very interesting to me. Okay, so Humpadori is a performing cosmic deformity, and it takes on different gender forms and object forms. And so you can see, like, partly I was like interested, I looked back at the history of, say, advertisement for soap and these different things that were really racialized. And one of the things that I did was I wrote poems from those perspectives. So I have this poem called Soap Friend, okay? And so Soap Friend is, so I'll read a little bit of that for you. Soap Friend, I marvel at your quivering surface, your skin a hoopla of zooing climates. You're a captive of the miasma of your age, the errant plumage, the multifold anxieties, the stinks. Little monster, it's time to dark continent with me. I'll get you off to another taxonomy. Whatever happens, you're going to be fine. Revulsion is not an option. A simple oscillation and you'll be laving it up in a radical hair shirt of cirrus, an exfoliated rose, prickling and scented, strangely empty, bent on redemption. Penitence is your fetish. You are guilty of nothing, scrubbed to the quick. You're smarting and hence alive. You're alive, so haven't really been beaten. Remember, the emulsion of alienation is luxurious, friend. I feel it all the time. I am painful. 0.0004% parts unknown, 100% glide. I'm so over myself as a form of spiritual butter. Okay, so this is sort of like taking on this sort of persona of soap as this sort of evil superhero monster that's been racialized in some ways. Okay. So another poem from Trouble with Humpadori is Live Desi Feed. And this is a poem where the cloud came up for me. And it was a transition poem that I think into Daughter Isotope. And it came from the Wordsworth poem, I wandered, the Wordsworth poem Daffodils, I wander lonely as a cloud. And I wanted to think of this sort of singular lyric subjectivity as something that was more about the group, about a collective. Okay, so in this, we wander only in the cloud, proud of our translational apparatus, we sing aloud. We're never lonely, we're a prism of martyr, hero, virgin. Our belts are tightening on veins filled with lightning speed drives, and among the 1,000 probability waves and flashing transmissions are jihad bits. So part of like daffodils, dil, it means heart in Hindi. So I was thinking about the sort of heart of this poem about the cloud descending into the daffodils. And so this leads me to, like this book is arranged in a series of 4 clouds. And I have a legend, this is Daughter Isotope. I have this legend in the beginning that has tags, and each of the poems are tagged. So you can read them either linearly, like a book, or you could read them as individual poems across time. So part of what I wanted to do with this was to think about time differently, not as time is something that's unfolding on itself, right? That it's not like, you've got this narrative of origins and it does just one thing, okay? So, so some of the things about the cloud are that it's an early metaphor for the internet. It's a network storage data archive. And so I look at these sort of poetic registers and I think about AI as aggregate identity memory streams, right? Like, so what would happen if you had these singularities or these AI that were sort of like a digital thief, right? A data thief that was taking from all of these different streams of identity. What might that be? So poems from this book, you can see, deal with this sort of idea of the upgrade, right? Because when you think of avatars online, you're always like upgrading, you can add, like when you think of those avatars, you can like win some points and get some special tools, et cetera, right? When you play these video games. So there's like a sort of gaming universe in this. And so like, for instance, Minotaur 2.2, I'm both Muni and Sati. I set myself on fire. I mourn briefly and am reborn into version 2.2, second generation Toreador bull. So there's something about like the avatar and the internet that allows for this perpetual transformation and upgrades, which is present in the text. The upgrade doesn't necessarily lead to liberation in this, right? It could be something else and something bad. Or interactive cartography, which is sort of like, a pill that you might swallow and have the internet in your body, right? Where like you become a sort of computer system or a post-human thing. My binges and gangs scan the world in microseconds. Like, so this is sort of imagining that space. So when I think of Asian American futurity, I think multiple fluid overlapping, which I think you could also think in terms of Afrofuturism as well. But Candace Chu talked about the term Asian American as fantasy links between body and subjectivity discursively forged in legal and literary text, in potential, always in process, what's emerging. And so particularly like the identity group of Asian American was something that's sort of invented in the States and is part of a political and legal discourse. And if you think about like even Desi futurism has to embody, or like South Asian futurisms have to embody many linguistic traditions and languages. Then if you think of Asian American, it's also doing that. And I think the terms like Julie and I were talking about, Afrofuturism, African futurism, it's embodying a lot of difference in that. So So I'm just curious about like how we recognize that difference. Then you have Tung Hu He in A Prehistory of the Cloud talked about the cloud as a topography or architecture of our own desire. So when you look at the cloud, it's layered with old and new media, right? So when you have the cloud as a network system of digital life, it's not like code just disappear, like the old code disappears. It's all janky and crazy, right? So it's built on top of each other and it's full of glitches. So I'm thinking of identity as being glitchy and janky and built on top of layered sort of media where the sediment isn't necessarily like, has a distinct historical lineage that you can actually say what's operating at any moment, right? Like the old stuff might emerge at some points and you just don't know when or where. So this temporality can be kind of glitchy and strange. The other thing about the cloud is it's subject to violence and penetrability. So we think of our digital archives, not, people can hack us, right? So it's porous and open. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the cloud and Daughter Isotope. It's a disparate cloud archives that offer visions of selfhood that are not easily contained or managed. Rather, these clouds are porous vehicles of fantasy that are alternatively technicolor, sticky, meandering, and turbulent. I also look at familial cultural mythology, such as a story of the Mahabharata with the nuclear industry, Emily Dickinson, Wizard of Oz, Michael Jackson. Like all these people come up like in this like topsy-turvy fashion. And so I'm not going to talk about encyclopedic thinking because it's just like too much. Okay, come on. Why is it not moving? We had this, okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, I didn't mean for it to do that. Okay, so I just wanted to say, so this is like a 2-page spread in the book. And one of the things that I did is that I'm using, so I took the poems in one section and I stuck them through various, like those word cloud systems that you can get on the internet. And I just kept doing it over and over again. And I made a collage out of those different systems that, so for me, I was trying to think of how a computer might create poems. And so this was part of my thinking around it and like sort of thinking about the contours of like, we don't know, when we have this digital realm, we don't know, like there's all of these locations where the networks are, but we don't know where they are. Like one place could be in China, one place could be in India or Korea, you know what I'm saying? Like, so you just don't know where your stuff is being channeled. And so partly I was just interested in thinking about like this sort of amorphous system. Okay, and so now I'm gonna, so I actually did some sort of digital poems where I remixed. So part of thinking about a cloud or remixing and sampling, this is something that is, really prevalent within Black music in this country, right? And so, in digital music. So partly one of the things that I've been doing is remixing poems. And so this is one called The Bunker of American Interiority. So I took this Emily Dickinson images with Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and I put them together so you can see this. Can you hear this?
Tweedle deedle dee tweedle deedle dum tweedle deedle dee tweedle deedle dum.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
Tweedle deedle
I
dee
meant
tweedle
word.
deedle
I
dum,
said
tweedle
terror.
deedle dee tweedle
Sorry,
deedle dum.
I made a mistake. I said terror. I meant error. I'm sorry I said error. I meant theory. I meant pleasure. Sorry, I made a mistake. I said terror. I meant error. I'm sorry I said error. I meant theory. I meant pleasure. I am a late settler on U.S. terrain.
Okay, and then, okay, sorry about that. I don't mean to play that again. Okay, then I made this for Julian and I were talking. So I have all of these symbols in this book, and Julian and I were talking before about the symbols sort of create their own language that might be arbitrary. Like I thought about categorization as sort of like, how do you create new languages? It's like by changing the categories, right? Or by having And so these are, like, that's Emily Dickinson as a weird goddess, okay? But at any rate, so I kind of did this little film. I'm gonna end with this. And it also used sort of like AI techniques, so text to speech, you know, like randomization of words and things like that. And so it's a sort of collaboration between me and the computer, in as much as some of my work is collaborations with actual humans. These are what I see as non-human procedural collaborations. Okay. So let me.
Because I was bullied, I have deity issues.
Deductively, establishes, causalities, disbelieves, subdialects, revitalizes, liabilities, timescales, causalities, switchblade, ceaselessly, establishes, wildebeest,
Because I was bullied, I have deity issues.
wildebeest,
Because I was bullied, I have deity issues. Because I was bullied, I have deity issues. I have deity issues.
So I'm going to stop there with this. I just love that line. Because I was bullied, I have deity issues. Okay, so I had to do something with that, right? Because I create this sort of radioactive divvy. And so I was just like, okay, what is this? What's this embodiment of the goddess? So I'm just like, yes. Okay.
The idea that we have a kind of machine intelligence working with our real person, great, I think they very Afrofuturist. Well, somebody does a futurist. One of the things that we were looking for with this talk is to sort of help people understand the ways that Afrofuturist ideas are bleeding across a kind of global diaspora that's influenced by a set of liberation and speculation and practices and so on and so forth. And I think we did that, and I want to thank Vidhu for sharing her work and sharing her reflections on the origins of her work. But we do have time for questions. So I will say again, if you have questions you're watching online, you have to put your question in the Q&A box. But for people here, if you have a question for Vidhu about Futurism, about the links to Afrofuturism, I like to call attention to, people might not know that Alice Coltrane she's talking about is John Coltrane's wife. It's a very, very famous, not popularly
she's not
known.
celebrated as much as
Not
she should be.
celebrated as much.
Not celebrated as
You're
much
right.
as she should
Should
be.
be.
Yeah.
Right, like this is a whole thing that
No,
Afrofuturists
it's
talk about a
cool.
lot. Like, oh yeah, people don't talk about Alice Coltrane enough. So that's the Alice Coltrane.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that. We got a question in the back. Oh, okay. Since the online people got shafted the last time, they get to go first. Go ahead.
This is from Teresa Carmody. She said, thank you, Julian and Vidhu, for this wonderful discussion. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about the relationship between connected pasts and articulated futures, especially as these ideas might relate to specific literary terms. Do you imagine a specific audience for your work? Or can you say more about the rhetoric of the address, the importance of both who is speaking, so POV, perspective, and historically marginalized voices, and who is being addressed towards an imagined future?
Okay. Wow.
You go first.
Me go first. Okay. That's like a really huge question. And I think for me at least, okay, so there's this Caribbean writer, Kama Brathwaite, whose work, he does this thing called video poetics. He recently died, and he's been very influential for me because he has multiple iterations of his work, right? Like he has different visual forms of his work, and it changes over time. And he feels this ability to just transform a thing that he already wrote. So the poem is never a sort of perfected form. It's always changing. It's always interacting. And so for me, I think one of the things that I think about in terms of audience and reception and the point of view is if you look at my website, I'm opening my work up. Like I want Julian to do a recording of my work. Would you do it, Julian?
Sure.
So what does it mean for Julian to occupy the subjectivity of the work? What can you take from it? And can you refashion it in some sense? Because that's the idea of sampling and sort of refashioning work. So for me, I want to in some way decenter myself from my work so that it can be, so that it isn't a final product. It's something that's always in process, and that I open it up for other people to take lines and reimagine them or do samples. And so this is something that I've been working on with folks and students and different people. So I don't know if that actually answers the question, but that way I feel like for me, language is always migratory, as Cecilia Vicuña said. And so I want that to be open. I don't want to have it be a sort of still perfect object, which is why I myself resample my own work.
Right. I think the answer to that question, or a partial answer to that question for me, is that there is a implication of practice in Afrofuturism that relies very heavily on a deconstruction of the system of power that is recognized by discourse and a remixing it for liberatory means. So the idea that jazz or rap or poetry is a space where sort of transgressive narratives and transgressive ideas are given a central place that maps out a possible future. That musological turn is so important to Afrofuturism or Desifuturism or any futurism. That's at the core. And I think that's the reason that who's making it does matter. When it's writers of color or writers from the margin, their engagement with the structure that is represented by language, is represented by art, is represented by design, and trying to do something different represents a kind of liberatory practice. So that would be my answer to that question. And I know that Dean Brody has a question way in the back. Why didn't you sit so far in the back? Okay.
Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation, by the way. The question I have is in music, since you mentioned Alice Coltrane, and things other than what Julian just mentioned in rap and in poetry where you have actual words, but in music you have sounds. And they transcend all of that. And I was thinking about the a piece that I heard last night, Black, Brown, and Beige by Duke Ellington. And I was thinking that in the conversation you were having, that there's a melding of people of color. And I'm thinking in the future, how do you see that? Because we all share that particular aspect, that we all are Black, Brown, and Beige in some shape or form, and in the future, do you see maybe a melding of all of us that share that similar background, as we sort of move into this futuristic world? What are your thoughts about that?
So, but I think one of the things is that that sharing is always happening in a way, right? Like, I feel like things are always migrating, and that we're already influenced by each other all the time. But can we acknowledge that, right? Can we acknowledge that? And so part of a liberatory practice for me is to say that the works of, to centralize the works of these artists that are on the margins, like Alice Coltrane, right? And sort of say, yes, let's gather up a different sort of history that reveals these connections. So whenever you're creating a future, so let's say whenever you're drawing upon a future, you're creating a new point of origins, you're reimagining a past, and you're selecting from that past what stories are important. And so for me, maybe that's why I'm looking to Du Bois and Alice Coltrane and stuff, because those connections actually empower me now to have different connections with artists from all different backgrounds who are POC, right? Like who share certain things with me, but who might have differences as well. And how can I acknowledge those differences, and how can I collaborate? And how can that sharing not merely be appropriation? How can we have some forms of relation that that aren't really just simply mimicking these sort of like these structures of power as they are. And, and I think that's really difficult, but I feel like that's part of it. Like, I feel like this has happened. There's been this exchange. And let's like sort of say, let's make that more operational, right? Let's like sort of say, yes.
Yeah, I do think that the chronopolitics of Afrofuturism, the politics of time, are really important. And the act of recovery, as I first talked today, talked about links and connections that are not necessarily always as evident on the surface, but when we look for them, especially as digital humanists, as scholars of digital humanities, when we look into the digital public record, we can see these connections to Black spaces, to Black practice, to Black people. It's interesting that some of these connections are so long established and so old, and the dependency of these set of ideas, especially around something like Futurism, where, as I mentioned before, you have African Americans who are engaging very deeply with ideas coming from India, engaging and being inspired by it. So there's a definite question here about, we're already in collaboration, we're already in conversation, we're already a set of subject bodies that are thinking about the implications of colonialism in the West. Can we recognize that those set of shared experiences mean that we have a set path that we might construct together? That's very important, I think, for a lot of futurism from all these different perspectives. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so appealing to people. We got time probably for one more question.
So this is from Jasmine Harris. So she said, Alice Coltrane has a song named Turiya and Ramakrishna. I understand that Turiya is a state of consciousness or pure awareness. Can you comment on the transcendentalism connection there may be to Afrofuturism?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know all the specifics of this sort of like higher consciousness modes, but you know what I do think is that there might be. I was having a conversation with Tanya Foster, and we were talking about the relationships or the sort of mediations of, say, theories of detachment, like Buddhist sort of detachment, and what that means, and Black cool, right? What those sorts of connections are. And so I think that that's really an interesting space to think about how these particular processes might be imagined differently in various communities, and then have this sort of cross-cultural conversation around it, right? But yeah, I do not know that specific term. Do you, Julian?
No, I know nothing.
Okay.
That's a good one. You stumped us. Come back next year. I think we'll
yeah,
be
I'll
talking
research
more.
it more. Okay.
And then we'll talk about this more next year. But that brings us back to the end of this session. I want to thank Vidhu Aggarwal for coming out and having this conversation with me about Futurism and its links to Afrofuturism, and sharing her work as I would argue, an expression of the implications of Futurism to the sort of global conversation about many possible futures that we're all advocating for, that are better, more accessible, and transformative. And so I want to thank her again. Give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Julian.
Thanks a lot.
Julian has been really important to my thinking. Okay, so thank you.
So we're taking another slight break, and we'll be back with a presentation. I think the next presentation up is Kiana Whittier, right? Lunchtime or yeah.
Okay,
After
thank you
lunch.
very much.
Okay, so thanks a lot.